The Great War was over. The world and America with it had been irrevocably altered. And in its wake, a profound yearning for calm, a return to simpler times after war, spread across the nation. This sentiment found its voice in the presidential campaign of 1920 and its champion in Warren G. Harding, who had a promise. His promise was a return to normalcy. Quote, America's present need is not heroics, but healing, not nostrums, but normalcy, not revolution, but restoration, not agitation, but adjustment, not surgery, but serenity, not the dramatic, but the dispassionate, not experiment, but equipoise, not submergence in internationality, but sustainment in triumphant nationality. End quote. Harding's words, delivered to the Home Market Club of Boston in May of 1920, struck a chord with the nation. The nation was exhausted by the global conflict, by the social reforms of the progressive era, and by a series of domestic crises that seemed to signal anything but peace. Between 1918 and 1920, the devastating influenza pandemic had claimed the lives of nearly 700,000 Americans, hitting almost 20% of the population. Lucien Van Vert, a Native American nurse volunteering in Washington, D.C. during the pandemic, wrote of soldiers dying by the dozens, that was her quote, and a city where all public life, that means schools, churches, theaters, had ground to a halt. This was a trauma etched deep in the national psyche. Then there was the Red Summer of 1919, a period of intense racial violence that erupted in at least 25 cities, including Chicago and Washington, D.C. The Chicago race riot alone, sparked by the drowning of a black teenager named Eugene Williams after he had crossed an invisible line at a segregated beach, it lasted 13 days, leaving 38 dead, 23 African Americans and 15 whites, while injuring over 500 more and leaving 1,000 black families homeless. This wave of violence underscored the raw, unresolved racial tensions simmering beneath the surface of American life. Adding to the instability, the immediate post-war period saw an economic downturn, with national unemployment soaring to 20% and farmers facing catastrophic bankruptcy rate. So Harding's call for normalcy was less a reflection of the existing reality and more of a potent political appeal to a deep-seated desire for respite. But the very forces unleashed by the war, the economic shifts, the experiences of returning soldiers, the heightened nationalisms, and the widespread disillusionment, made a simple return to the pre-war state an illusion. The war had mobilized American industry and society on an unprecedented scale, and these changes couldn't be reversed, including the new roles for women and other minorities, and it just wasn't feasible to go back to some kind of pre-war normal. The psychological scars of war, with the pandemic and the Red Scare, created a volatile social landscape. Normalcy was the promise, but the 1920s would be anything but normal. So to talk about the 1920s, this decade, it cannot be understood in isolation. It was profoundly shaped by the legacy of the preceding eras. The failures of Reconstruction, for instance, cast a long shadow. The inability to secure lasting civil and economic rights for African Americans in the South, leading to the entrenchment of Jim Crow, the exploitative sharecropping system, the pervasive racial terror we've talked about in previous episodes, well, these directly fueled the Great Migration. As hundreds of thousands of African Americans moved north seeking economic opportunity as well as an escape from Southern oppression, lynching, violence, they carried these unresolved national wounds with them, reshaping urban centers. And they laid the groundwork for a new cultural expression as well as continued racial conflict, even in the North. As the National Archives itself notes regarding this earlier exoduster movement that we talked about, the failure of Reconstruction led to what Carter G. Woodson called, quote, slavery in a modified form, and it compelled many to seek refuge and opportunity elsewhere in the nation away from the South. This same dynamic propelled the larger waves of this great migration. Simultaneously, the industrial behemoth that was forged in the Gilded Age provided the technological and economic engine that powered the 1920s. The era's newfound mass production coming out of the war, its dazzling consumer goods, its sprawling cities were all built upon the foundations we talked about, laid in the 19th century. Yet the Gilded Age also gave a legacy of vast inequality, bitter labor disputes, and severe urban problems like overcrowding and poor sanitation, issues that continued to provoke social critique and demands for reform in the 1920s, which was called the New Era. I've used this quote before, but I'll use it again here. Speaking about the British author Rudyard Kipling, who had visited Chicago in 1889 at the height of the Gilded Age, and he described a city, quote, captivated by technology and blinded by greed, a huge wilderness of terrible streets and terrible people, end quote. His words capture the mixture of awe and unease that industrial modernity inspired, and ambivalence that would only intensify in the decade of the 1920s. Therefore, the 1920s, often dubbed the Roaring Twenties or the New Era, was far from a simple return to normalcy. Instead, it was a dynamic and deeply contradictory decade, a cultural and social battleground where the forces of modernity clashed with traditional values, where unprecedented prosperity and technological advancement existed alongside profound social anxieties, and where new voices of liberation and artistic expression challenged the old order. In this episode, we'll explore these tensions from the assembly lines and the airwaves that reshaped American life to the resurgence of the KKK and the culture wars that sought to define what it meant to be American, all while reconnecting and connecting these developments to the enduring legacies of the 19th century Reconstruction and industrialization. So let's go. So let's imagine if we can capture the dynamism of the 1920s, and it might best be done by thinking about the gleaming hood of a Ford Model T rolling off the assembly line, ready to transform the American landscape and the very rhythm of daily life. This was the machine age, and its gears were driven by mass production, birthing a new consumer republic. And at the forefront of this transformation was Henry Ford. His relentless pursuit of efficiency through the moving assembly line didn't just build cars, it kind of built a new form of America. The innovation, first successfully implemented at his Highland Park assembly plant in 1913, dramatically slashed the time it took to build a Model T from over 12 hours to a mere 93 minutes by 1914. By 1925, Ford's factories were churning out up to 10,000 cars a day. This incredible output increase over the decade made the automobile, which was once a luxury, accessible to the average American. The price of a Model T also plummeted from $850 in 1908 to just $300 in 1924 because of the mass production. Ford himself famously declared, quote, "We believe in making 25,000 men prosperous and contented rather than follow the plan of making a few slave drivers in our establishment multimillionaires," end quote. This was part of his justification for the revolutionary $5 workday, which he introduced in 1914. While seemingly altruistic, this move was also a pragmatic response to the grueling, monotonous nature of the assembly line work, which had led to a staggering 370% labor turnover rate at his Highland Park factory. The higher wage, though initially a profit-sharing bonus with strings attached, Ford's sociological department was even inspected workers' homes to ensure they lived according to company approved standards. It did attract and retain workers. It also cannily turned his own employees into potential customers. While it was a pragmatic response for the turnover, it also has to be reviewed in the response to labor issues and wanting to avoid strikes as well. Ford was smart in that aspect. The impact of the affordable automobile was seismic. Industries like glass, steel, and rubber boomed to meet the production demands of more cars. The very landscape of America began to change. As our textbook notes, quote, streetcar suburbs gave way to automobile suburbs, end quote. Families could now live further from urban cores, leading to an explosive growth of suburban communities, with developers designing new homes complete with driveways and garages for their new cars. Rural life, too, was transformed. The car began to erode the profound isolation that had characterized much of farm existence. A trip to town, once an all-day affair by a horse and wagon, can now be done in a matter of hours. As one farm woman succinctly put it when asked why her family bought a car before getting indoor plumbing in their home, quote, why you can't go to a town in a bathtub, end quote. By 1920, a third of American farmers owned a car, using it not just for transportation, but also for hauling goods and even as a source of farm machinery power. This new mobility fostered a roadside culture. Up started to pop gas stations, diners, motels, and the ubiquitous billboards, which sprang up to cater to the traveling public. Auto camping, or gypsying as it was called, became a popular pastime, even among the wealthy, with figures like Henry Ford and even President Harding himself partaking in the activity. So while the automobile started to conquer physical distance, another invention was conquering the ether, the radio. In the 1920s, radio transitioned from a tinkerer's curiosity to a household necessity. Sales skyrocketed from about $60 million in 1922 to $426 million by 1929. That's a sevenfold increase. And by that year, over 10 million American households had a radio. It was more than just an entertainment device. The radio became a powerful unifying force. As our textbook highlights, it, quote, drew the nation together, blunted regional differences, and imposed similar tastes and lifestyles, end quote. For the first time, Americans from coast to coast could share the same experiences simultaneously. They could listen to the same news, the same music, and hear the same stories. The reach of the radio cannot be understated because it was unprecedented. It penetrated even the homes where literacy was a barrier, something that newspapers could not do. The writer E.B. White would later recall radio's impact on rural communities, describing it as almost a godlike presence. The airwaves crackled with a variety of programming. Musical shows were immensely popular, bringing jazz from Harlem's Cotton Club, performed by iconic artists like Duke Ellington and Benny Goodman, to a national audience. Comedy shows like Amos and Andy, despite perpetuating very harmful racial stereotypes, became a national phenomenon. News, political speeches, and play-by-play sports broadcasting also filled the airwaves, transforming how Americans engaged with current events and leisure. Sitting down and listening to a ball game by the radio, still one of my favorite things to do. The first live broadcast of presidential election results occurred in 1920 on the station KDKA in Pittsburgh, and by the 1924 election, just 4 years later, radio had become a significant campaign tool. So this explosion of mass-produced goods and mass media created the fertile ground for another booming industry, advertising. Our favorite thing. We all love ads. The 1920s saw advertising transform from a largely informal service to a powerful, pervasive force. The total advertising volume in the United States grew from about 200 million in 1880 to nearly $3 billion in 1920. And by 1929, some 600,000 Americans worked in the advertising industry itself. Advertisers began to employ sophisticated psychological techniques and emotional appeals to create a desire for products, moving beyond simply responding to demand to actively creating that demand. The Listerine campaign, for example, didn't just sell mouthwash. It sold relief from a newly minted social anxiety of halitosis. Coca-Cola invited customers to pause that refreshes. As one contemporary observer noted, quote, advertisers were no longer simply responding to demand, they were creating the demand, end quote. This new culture of consumption was further enabled by the widespread adoption of also something new, consumer credit. The mantra, buy now, pay later, took hold. Department stores offered generous lines of credit, and installments plans made big ticket items like the automobile and new household appliances attainable for many middle class families who couldn't afford to buy them wholesale with a lump sum. By the end of the decade, an astonishing 75% of cars were purchased on credit. The economic engine of the 1920s, therefore, was a complex machine of interdependent parts. Mass production, fueled by industrial advancement, churned out an unprecedented volume of goods. Mass media, particularly the radio and national magazines, created a unified audience for advertisers who, in turn, cultivated new desires and aspirations. The consumer credit provided the mechanism for these desires to be translated into purchases to be consumed. This cycle propelled a prosperity of the roaring 20s, but it also embedded a reliance on continuous consumption and debt that would have profound consequences when the economic winds shifted. While these technologies fostered a national culture by breaking down regional barriers and exposing diverse populations to shared products and media and news, they also paradoxically contributed to a new form of social segmentation. The automobile, for instance, facilitated the growth of the suburbs, which often became segregated by class. Radio programs, while creating this shared experiences, sometimes did so by reinforcing harmful stereotypes, particularly of African Americans in shows like Amos and Andy. Access to these new consumer goods and technologies was not universal, and it often reflected and reinforced existing class and racial divides. Thus, the very tools for forging a national culture were simultaneously inscribing new lines of division. Amidst the roar of the engines and the crackle of radio waves, new voices were rising, challenging the old norms and forging fresh identities. The 1920s was a period of profound cultural ferment, nowhere more vibrantly expressed than that in the Harlem Renaissance and the emergence of the new woman. These movements didn't just reflect the times, they actively shaped them, offering powerful critiques and alternative visions of American life. So let's start with the Harlem Renaissance. The Great Migration, that vast movement of African Americans from the rural South to the industrial North, was more than just a demographic shift. It was a catalyst for a cultural revolution. Harlem in New York City became the epicenter of this transformation. Its black population exploded, growing by 257% between 1910 and 1930, and it grew to over 327,000 people. As one contemporary account noted, quote, Harlem became a destination for African Americans of all backgrounds. They shared common experiences of slavery, emancipation, and racial oppression, as well as a determination to forge a new identity as free people, end quote. This concentration of talent, experience, and aspiration created the fertile ground for what became known as the Harlem Renaissance. Now, a key intellectual architect of the Harlem Renaissance in this movement was Alain Locke. In his seminal 1925 essay, Enter the New Negro, Locke proclaimed that the arrival of a black populace imbued with a new psychology and undergoing a spiritual emancipation. The old Negro, as Locke argued, quote, was a creature of moral debate and historical controversy, more of a formula than a human being, end quote. This new Negro, by contrast, was shaking off, quote, the psychology of imitation and implied inferiority, end quote. This was a declaration of intellectual and cultural independence. This new spirit found powerful expression in literature. Men like Langston Hughes, perhaps he was the most iconic poet of the Renaissance itself, and he championed the beauty and the resilience of everyday black life, infusing his work with the rhythms of jazz and blues. In his 1926 essay, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, Hughes challenged black artists to embrace their heritage and resist the, quote, urge towards whiteness, the desire to conform to white artistic standards. He declared, quote, we younger Negro artists who create now intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. We build our temples for tomorrow, strong as we know how, and we stand on top of the mountain, free within ourselves, end quote. His poem, entitled I Too, captures the spirit of this assertive belonging. Quote, I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes. But I laugh, and I eat well, and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when the company comes. End quote. Zora Neale Hurston, another towering figure, celebrated Southern black folk culture and explored the multifaceted identities of black women. Her 1928 essay, How It Feels to Be Colored Me, offers a defiant and individualistic perspective on race. She famously wrote, quote, I am not tragically colored. There is no great sorrow dammed up in my soul, nor lurking behind my eyes. I do not mind at all, end quote. And with her characteristic wit, quote, sometimes I feel discriminated against, but it does not make me angry. It merely astonishes me. How can any deny themselves the pleasure of my company? It's beyond me, end quote. Claude McKay, a Jamaican immigrant, brought a militant fire to his poetry. His sonnet, If We Must Die, penned in response to the Red Summer of 1919, became an anthem of resistance. Quote, if we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot. Like men will face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. End quote. His poem America in 1921 expressed a more ambivalent yet powerful engagement with his adopted homeland. Quote, although she feeds me bread of bitterness and sinks into my throat her tiger's tooth, stealing my breath of life, I will confess, I love this cultured hell that tests my youth. End quote. Visual artists also flourished. Aaron Douglas, often called the father of African American modernism, created murals like Aspects of Negro Life in 1934 that depicted the historical journey and cultural heritage of African Americans, blending African motifs with modern aesthetics. His work visually narrated the Black experience, making history and identity accessible and instilling pride. And then, of course, there was the music. The 1920s was undeniably the jazz age, and Harlem was its beating heart. Innovators like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong revolutionized American music, and I can't stress that enough. Ellington himself captured the allure of the place, saying, quote, Harlem in our minds had the world's most glamorous atmosphere. We had to go there, end quote. Venues like the Cotton Club became legendary, though they often embodied a central paradox of the era, showcasing incredible black talent in the music on stage, but to exclusively white audiences. It was a stark reminder of the pervasive segregation even within this cultural blossoming and even in the North. Black culture was being celebrated and consumed, yet often on the terms dictated by a segregated society, highlighting the complex interplay of artistic freedom, economic necessity, and racial inequality. Magazines like The Crisis, published by the NAACP under the editorial leadership of W.E.B. Du Bois and literary editor Jesse Redmond Fawcett, and Opportunity, published by the National Urban League with Charles S. Johnson at the helm, played a crucial role in nurturing and promoting this new wave of black writers and artists, often through literary contests and providing a platform for their work to be published. These publications were vital in shaping and disseminating the ideas of the Harlem Renaissance. Parallel to the emergence of the new Negro, the 1920s witnessed the rise of the new woman. The iconic image of the flapper with her bobbed hair, short skirts, makeup, and a penchant for smoking cigarettes, drinking cocktails, and dancing to jazz symbolized a broader challenge to the Victorian norms of femininity and domesticity. The new woman was more than just a fashion statement. She represented a deeper shift in women's roles and aspirations, significantly fueled by the achievement of national suffrage with the 19th Amendment in 1920. Feminist and socialist Crystal Eastman, in her 1920 essay, Now We Can Begin, articulated a forward-looking agenda. With the vote won, she argued, the real fight for women's freedom could commence. For Eastman, this meant, quote, how to arrange the world so that women can be human beings, instead of being destined by the accident of their sex to one field of activity, housework and child raising, end quote. She called for economic independence, a, quote, revolution in the early training and education of both boys and girls, end quote, to dismantle traditional gender roles in domestic labor, and voluntary motherhood through access to birth control. She quipped, quote, men will not give up their privilege of helplessness without a struggle, end quote. Women's activism in the 1920s extended into various spheres. They were prominent in peace movements with organizations like the Women's Peace Party, which became the U.S. section of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and they advocated for international cooperation and military disarmament. They lobbied for labor regulations and child welfare. A significant legislative victory was the Shepard-Toner Act of 1921, which provided federal funds for maternal and child health clinics, a landmark piece of social welfare legislation heavily influenced by women's advocacy groups like the Women's Joint Congressional Committee. This act demonstrated the newfound political leverage of enfranchised women and their commitment to social reform, providing a model for future federal-state partnerships. In addition to these was Margaret Sanger, who was a leading figure in the birth control movement and in founding of the American Birth Control League in 1921, tirelessly campaigning for women's reproductive rights despite facing legal challenges and social opposition. Her work, however, was complicated by her association with the eugenics movement. In 1920, Sanger stated that, quote, birth control is nothing more or less than the facilitation of the process of weeding out the unfit and preventing the birth of defectives, end quote. This alignment, though Sanger reportedly opposed eugenics along purely racial lines, tarnished her legacy and highlighted the complex and sometimes troubling intersection of 20th century reform movements. The era's exuberance and excesses also drew sharp criticism from some of America's leading literary figures who saw a hollowness beneath the glittering surface. Sinclair Lewis, in novels like Main Street and Babbitt, satirized the conformity, materialism, and anti-intellectualism of small-town and middle-class American life. His character George F. Babbitt, a prosperous real estate broker in the fictional city of Zenith, became an archetype of the unthinking, self-satisfied American businessman. Lewis, through Babbitt's voice in a speech, captured this mindset. Quote, "Here's the specification of the standardized American citizen. We're not doing any boasting, but we like ourselves first rate, and if you don't like us, look out. Better get under cover before the cyclone hits town." End quote. Maybe the best well known is F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby in 1925, which offered a poignant critique of the American dream, exposing its corruption by wealth and class and the moral decay of the Jazz Age. Jay Gatsby's tragic pursuit of Daisy Buchanan, a symbol of old money and an idealized past, ends in disillusionment and death. The novel's famous closing lines resonate with a sense of striving against an elusive dream. Quote, "So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past." End quote. Nick Carraway, the narrator, observes Daisy's failure to live up to Gatsby's, quote, "colossal vitality of his illusion," a powerful commentary on the nature of aspiration and reality. And then there was H.L. Mencken, the sage of Baltimore, whose biting satire filled the pages of the American Mercury. Mencken relentlessly attacked American conformity, Puritanism, and what he derisively termed the bourgeoisie. He famously quipped, quote, "Democracy is the theory that the common people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard," end quote. And speaking of American Puritanism, he wrote, quote, "assumes that every human act must be either right or wrong, and that 90% of them are wrong," end quote. These writers, each in their own way, held up the mirror to the 1920s America, reflecting not just its achievements, but also its anxieties and hypocrisies. So let's move on to the backlash and the division, the culture wars of these 1920s. The Roaring Twenties weren't just about jazz and flappers. Beneath the surface of prosperity and cultural innovation, deep-seated anxieties about the rapid pace of change fueled a powerful backlash. This was a decade of profound cultural conflict, pitting urban modernism against the rural traditionalism, science against fundamentalist religion, and a diversifying America against a resurgent exclusionary nativism. Politically speaking, the 1920s were dominated by a trio of conservative Republican presidents: Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. They shared a largely pro-business ideology, emphasizing limited government regulation and fiscal conservatism. Harding, as we had heard, promised that return to normalcy. Calvin Coolidge, famously taciturn, encapsulated the era's economic philosophy with the often quoted, though contextually nuanced phrase, quote, "The chief business of the American people is business," end quote. He delivered this to the American Society of Newspaper Editors in 1925, and this statement underscored the centrality of commerce in the national identity. Coolidge's administration, with Andrew Mellon as Secretary of the Treasury, championed significant tax cuts, particularly for the wealthy, under the belief that this would trickle down and stimulate the economy. While Coolidge favored a light-handed business regulation, his administration did sign the Radio Act, establishing a federal oversight of the radio, this new medium, and he blocked farm relief bills like the McNary-Hogan, believing that market forces, rather than government intervention, would be the best help for farmers. Herbert Hoover, who had served as Secretary of Commerce under Harding and Coolidge before his own presidency, promoted what he called associationalism, a system of voluntary cooperation between government and business. In his 1928 speech on the principles and ideals of the United States government, Hoover championed the American system of, quote, "ordered liberty, freedom, and equal opportunity to the individual," end quote, arguing this individual initiative was the engine of American progress. He warned against government overreach, stating, quote, "bureaucracy is ever desirous of spreading its influence and its power. Free speech does not live many hours after free industry and free commerce die," end quote. This economic philosophy, prioritizing business and individual enterprise, defined the Republican leadership of the decade. However, this era of Republican dominance was also marred by scandal, most notably the Teapot Dome scandal during Hardin's administration. Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall was convicted of accepting bribes for secretly leasing federal oil reserves at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California, to private oil companies. Fall became the first U.S. cabinet member to be imprisoned for crimes committed in office. Though Harding himself was not personally implicated, and he passed away before any damage could be done to him, his awareness of corruption within his own Ohio gang and his failure to act severely damaged his reputation and public trust in the government. Had he not passed away prematurely, he might have had more problems. Another backlash of this era was the anxieties that the new era itself manifested, and it manifested in a virulent wave of nativism and violence with the disturbing reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan. The second Klan was born in 1915 but exploded in membership in the early 1920s, and it claimed millions of members, not just in the South, but across the nation, and particularly in the Midwest. This new Klan broadened its targets beyond African Americans to include Catholics, Jews, recent immigrants, and especially those from Southern and Eastern Europe. Hiram Evans, a dentist who became the imperial wizard of the Klan, articulated his ideology in his 1926 article, The Klan Fights for Americanism. He proclaimed the Klan spoke for, quote, the great mass of Americans of the old pioneer stock, whom he defined as belonging to the Nordic race. Evans argued that these, quote, old stock Americans had felt their traditional moral standards, the sanctity of the Sabbath, the home, and chastity, had been eroded by what he called strange ideas and aliens. The Klan's definition of Americanism was explicitly exclusionary, based on, quote, loyalty to the white race, to the traditions of America, and to the spirit of Protestantism, end quote. Their slogan, Evans stated, was, quote, native, white, Protestant supremacy, end quote. The Klan's method included intimidation, but also violence, such as lynching, arson, beating, and significant political maneuvering. They wielded considerable political power in states like Indiana, where Grand Dragon David C. Stevenson boasted, quote, I am the law in Indiana, as well as in Oregon, where the Klan was instrumental in efforts to ban Catholic schools. This resurgence can be understood as a direct backlash against the very diversification and modernization that defined the 1920s. The Klan's targets, Catholics, Jews, immigrants, the new Negro, were the embodiment of a changing America that threatened the perceived cultural and social dominance of white Protestants. Now, the anxieties of the 1920s also ignited a fierce battle between religious fundamentalism and scientific modernism. Most famously, this was dramatized in the Scopes trial of 1925. It's often been called the Monkey Trial, and this courtroom showdown in Dayton, Tennessee, pitted the renowned lawyer Clarence Darrow defending high school teacher John Scopes for teaching evolution, and he went up against the three-time presidential candidate and fundamentalist champion William Jennings Bryan, who assisted the prosecution. The trial became a national media spectacle, the first to be broadcast live on radio by WGN. Journalists, including the acerbic H.L. Mencken of the Baltimore Sun, descended upon Dayton, with Mencken famously dubbing it, quote, Monkeytown, and he ridiculed Bryan and the fundamentalist cause. Darrow declared, quote, Scopes isn't on trial, civilization is on trial, end quote. And he framed it as a fight for intellectual freedom against bigotry. Bryan, during Darrow's relentless cross-examination about biblical literalism, proclaimed, quote, I am simply trying to protect the Word of God against the greatest atheist or agnostic in the United States, end quote. While Scopes was ultimately found guilty, a verdict later overturned on a technicality, The trial exposed deep divisions in American society over science, religion, and education, and many saw Darrow's grilling of Bryan as a symbolic victory for modernism. The Scopes trial was a flashpoint for the broader rise of Christian fundamentalism. This movement, gaining traction in the early 20th century, emphasized biblical inerrancy and vehemently opposed Darwin's theory of evolution and other aspects of modern thought that they saw as undermining traditional Christian values. Leaders like William Bell Riley, founder of the World Christian Fundamentalist Association in 1919, and fiery evangelists like Billy Sunday, who proclaimed, quote, Christianity and patriotism are synonymous terms, and hell and traitors are synonymous, end quote. They mobilized conservative Christians against what they perceived as societal decay from this roaring 20s. They aimed to, quote, hold the line against change in American culture. How can we talk about the 1920s without talking about prohibition, the noble experiment? This was another major cultural battleground of the 1920s. The 18th Amendment, ratified in 1919, and the subsequent Volstead Act, which banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors, defined stringently as anything containing over 0.5% alcohol. Motivations were mixed. Progressive era desires to curb social ills associated with alcohol, as well as anti-immigrant sentiment targeting the drinking cultures of ethnic groups, and the moral fervor of rural Protestant Americans clashing with urban lifestyles, led to the banning of alcohol. Enforcement of the Volstead Act proved immensely challenging. The result was widespread flouting of the law. Bootlegging, the illegal production and sale of alcohol, became a massive underground industry. Speakeasies, the secret bars and nightclubs, proliferated in cities, becoming iconic symbol of the era's defiance. This illicit trade fueled the rise of organized crime, with figures like Chicago's Al Capone earning fortunes, an estimated $60 million annually from bootlegging and speakeasies for Capone. The era saw a corresponding rise in gang violence, notoriously exemplified by the St. Valentine's Massacre in Chicago of 1929. Prohibition also led to increased corruption within law enforcement and a general disrespect for the law and the ultimate weakening of public trust. So while America grappled with its internal culture wars, the new ominous ideology was taking root in Europe: fascism. In October 1922, Benito Mussolini and his black shirts staged their march on Rome, leading to Mussolini's appointment as prime minister and the subsequent consolidation of fascist power in Italy. Americans' reactions to Mussolini's rise were varied and they were complex. Some segments of the American press and public expressed admiration for Mussolini, particularly for fascism's staunch anti-communism and its perceived restoration of order and discipline. The Kansas City Star in August of 1922, for instance, even identified Mussolini's fascism with, quote, 100% Americanism, end quote. Mussolini himself, in an interview with the Dallas Morning News, emphasized discipline and work as his guiding principles. Others, however, viewed the rise of fascism with measured unease, fearing its militaristic rhetoric and the potential for another European war, as was noted by the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. These early American responses often interpreted fascism through a domestic American lens, sometimes praising its perceived strength in combating radicalism or promoting national unity, while often underestimating its inherent dangers and its fundamental departure from democratic principles. This foreshadowed the complex and often hesitant response by Americans to the growing threat of fascism in the 1920s, in the 1930s, even leading up to World War II. So the 1920s then, this decade that began with a plea for normalcy and ended on the precipice of the Great Depression. It was, as we've seen, anything but normal. It was an era of dazzling technological innovation. The automobile and the radio forever altered the fabric of American life. It created a mass consumer culture fueled by new advertising techniques and the seductive promise of credit. It was an era of profound cultural renaissance as the new Negro of Harlem proclaimed a new racial consciousness and artistic vibrancy. And the new woman challenged traditional gender roles, demanding new freedoms in their social, economic, and personal lives. Yet this new era was an age of deep contradictions. The prosperity was unevenly distributed, and the decade's innovations were met with fierce resistance. Conservative politics sought to rein in the perceived excesses of modern life. The Ku Klux Klan experienced a terrifying resurgence, preaching a doctrine of, quote, native white Protestant supremacy, end quote, against the backdrop of increasing immigration and black migration. The Scopes trial became a national referendum on science versus fundamentalist Christianity, and prohibition, the noble experiment, bred organized crime and widespread disrespect for the law. Even as America looked inward, the rise of fascism in Europe cast a long and ominous shadow. The 1920s then was a critical turning point. The battles fought over cultural values, racial equality, the role of women, the definition of Americanism, and the relationship between tradition and modernity were not resolved. Instead, they laid the groundwork for the economic catastrophe of the Great Depression, our next episode, as well as the global conflict of World War II, the episode after that, and many of the social and cultural debates that continue to resonate in American society today. The echoes of the Jazz Age, with its vibrant creativity and its stark divisions, can still be heard. As H.L. Mencken, one of the era's sharpest critics, observed, quote, the whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary, end quote. Perhaps the hobgoblins of the 1920s were not entirely imaginary, but reflection of a nation grappling with its own rapidly changing identity. Thanks for coming out to Star-Spangled Studies. I'm Dr. G. I'll see y'all in the past.